What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to Grand Theories, Episode 4. I am your host, Mark. This is a podcast where we explore lesser-known ideas that try to explain really big things about the world we live in. Quickly before we get started, I am on social media if you're a fan of the show. You can follow me at Grand Theories on Instagram or on Twitter where I'm most active at Grand_Theories. And if you want to get in touch, I'm also on Gmail. It is grandtheories@gmail.com. So if you have any questions, requests, just hit me up. In addition, the music on today's show is from a producer named Benjamin Banger. I've actually used one of his tunes for the theme of the show, and you'll hear a lot of his beats today. So if you enjoy his work, check out the show notes. I have all the details there. Now, in today's episode, we're going to step back a little bit from things like conscious rocks and gluons and holograms and talk about a topic that's a little bit more earthly. Now, if you like the gluons, you don't need to worry because we're going to bring that type of stuff back in the next episode. But none of that should stop you from enjoying today's episode because, plain and simply, it's about one of the possibly most important things in all of our lives: happiness. And in particular, we're going to talk about an idea called the capability approach, which in essence will give us a recipe for happiness. So by the end of this episode, not only should we have an idea of what the capability approach is and how it fits into today's world, but we'll use a semi-famous philosophical thought problem to ponder one way we could realistically get to the capability approach's ultimate vision. The truth is that the capability approach has touched a lot of our institutions and ways of life today. But from a philosophical perspective, its ideas are a little bit more obscure to the general public. So before we talk about how the capability approach cultivates happiness, we're going to need to, as you probably guessed, understand what happiness really is. In today's society, and to that I'm referring particularly to Western society, and even more specifically, the United States, happiness is held to be a paramount quality in a good life. Happiness is packaged and sold to us via commercials, social media, books, or even methods of controlling our own thoughts. The recent ascent of the field of positive psychology is a testament to how deeply we value happiness. And even though the stigma has been somewhat lifted, appearing unhappy or depressed can still be perceived in a negative fashion. Now, I'm not trying to sound jaded here, but I am trying to make the point that, at least in my view, the value of happiness can go unquestioned at times. It's packaged in a way as something that we can never really get enough of. In this sense, happiness is plain and simply a common sense pursuit. But life may not be an all-out race toward an endless supply of happiness like we might think. And if we glance into the world of philosophy, things start to look a little bit less one-dimensional. Now, there's a good chance that when you try to imagine happiness, it's probably much different, or at least a little bit different, than how I or some other listener organize it in our minds. Philosophy has had the same struggle in trying to figure out happiness across the board for all of humanity. Some corners of the discipline posit happiness as an internal emotional state, whereas some might associate it with life's external hedonistic pleasures. Others view happiness in a much broader sense, a state of being satisfied with one's life despite all the ups and downs that come with it. Outside of what happiness actually is, the debate gets really rich when pondering how to find happiness. Many famous philosophers have made their ilk in putting forward opinions on this. Names like Plato, Al-Ghazali, and Confucius, among others, equated happiness with leading a moral, virtuous life. all chiming in their own specific methods of how to live that out. The Epicureans of ancient Greece, meanwhile, espoused maximizing life's tranquil pleasures and minimizing discomfort as a recipe for the highest satisfaction. And on another hand, both the cynics of ancient Greece and the Buddhists push a more minimalist, virtuous, and naturalistic path to happiness. And these are just a few of the many philosophical musings on happiness over time. And what you'll find in all those readings is a lengthy and variety-filled laundry list of habits, mentalities, and lifestyles that will lead one toward the good life. But in spite of all these differences on the topic, one thing is clear about happiness. It's been highly pondered and highly valued throughout the history and geography of our world. So what if I told you that happiness isn't held as this ultimate good across the board? What if I told you that there are people who have a more neutral feeling toward happiness, or a distaste for this emotion, or even an aversion to it? In 2013, two happiness scholars named Mohsen Joshanlu and Dan Vayers published a paper about what they call an aversion to happiness. And in the paper, they highlight a wide variety of psychological and sociological research that supports the concept of people essentially becoming avoidant of feeling happy. Now, what this phenomenon entails is when, plain and simply, a person or even groups of people have a dislike or a fear of feeling happy. The authors categorize a number of different reasons as to why this might happen. And in some cases, this aversion is correlated with depression or other mental health diagnoses. But according to Joshanlu and Vayers, people avoid happiness for many perceived reasons. For one, some people believe being happy will eventually, inevitably, lead to a deep sadness. This plays on the old quote, "What goes up must come down." Some report that being happy can cause them to lose touch with their morality or even their religious faith. But in my view, perhaps the most illustrative example that's provided is an old anthropological study of the Ephah Luke. The Ephah Luke are a people inhabiting a tiny atoll in the Micronesia region of the Pacific. The study found that in the small but tight-knit Ephah Luke society, happiness on the whole is associated with excess, with showing off, or even with a lack of awareness or completion of one's communal duties. Because of this, appearing overly happy can quickly draw annoyance or even ire from others. Now, the Ephah Luke are a small, highly communal tribe that commits to sharing societal duties in order to ensure survival. In a community where people truly need each other to not only thrive, but to survive, expressing one's happiness at the expense of risking isolation isn't worth it at all. Thus, we can now see how an aversion to expressing and even experiencing happiness might develop in the case of the Ephah Luke. It's anecdotes like this and the other evidence that Joshanlu and Vayers provide in their paper that suggest a very important idea. The value of happiness isn't universal. It's cultural and even individual. So while being happy seems to play a pretty central role in Western society, it is possible for us to easily imagine how the emotion can be de-emphasized or even disadvantageous in other cultures. And as Joshanlu and Vayers put it, the aversions to happiness that they found tend to be more prevalent in cultures that value the pursuits of the group as opposed to the pursuits of the individual. Happiness is just one of many elements of a good life that's filled with well-being. There's a deeper idea of happiness that doesn't relate to just feeling or experiencing joy in one moment or a series of moments. The happiness that I want to talk about today is a longer-term, deeper state, a state that none other than Aristotle originally referred to as flourishing. A life where someone is flourishing doesn't just involve existing in an eternal state of bliss from birth to death. To flourish, instead, is to live a full life, a life where one synergizes positively with people and society, where one sets and achieves goals and feels positive about the direction that life is moving in. It's a life where one pursues what she or he wants to pursue. And if feeling happy all the time is one of those pursuits, then that's great. But happiness isn't a requirement to flourish. One could focus their efforts instead on being a good and productive member of society, being selfless, leading a moral life, or anything else that takes precedence over immediate happiness. In short, happiness is just one part of flourishing. How big a role it plays is up to the individual. So with all that said, when I talk about happiness in this episode, I'm really referring to this deeper idea of flourishing that we've just gone over. So I'll plan to use the terms of well-being, happiness, and flourishing interchangeably throughout the rest of the episode. Now, as we can start to imagine, measuring how much someone is flourishing is difficult enough. There's a lot that goes into that, particularly over the course of a life that might last 70, 80, and even 90 years. Things are going to get even more complex as we try to address the key question of today's episode. How do we ensure that our entire society is flourishing? There are a number of competing attempts to answer this question, but today we're going to focus on a slightly lesser-known blueprint for societal well-being, a school of thought known as the capability approach. The capability approach is a broad framework that is perhaps most famously applied to the world of international aid and development. Today it has a group of committed scholars from many disciplines, but its deepest roots can be traced back to two people in particular: an economist named Amartya Sen and a philosopher named Martha Nussbaum. Now, it's Amartya Sen who is credited as the person who first introduced the capability approach in its most famous form. Amartya Sen was born in India to a Bangladeshi family in an area now known as West Bengal. When Sen was only 9 years old, he and his family endured the Bengal famine of 1943. This disaster took the lives of over 1 million people. During this key time in his childhood, Sen witnessed much unneeded death and agony, which largely affected Bengal's rural population. Sen obviously survived, but the effect of what he witnessed was everlasting. Fast forward to the early 1980s, at which point Sen was a working academic. In 1981, he released a book briefly titled Poverty and Famines. In the book, he provides a mountain of evidence to suggest that many of the famines that occurred throughout history didn't occur because of food shortages. In many cases, in fact, there's often enough food available so that everyone can eat. The causes of famines instead lie in social inequalities that prevent the poorest and worst off from accessing food. Sen draws heavily on the Bengal famine that he lived through and the suffering that he personally witnessed. He points to nearby regional conflicts and a rapid, sharp rise in food prices as the main factors that caused the famine. In sum, Sen concludes that, for the most part, many of the devastating famines from throughout history could have been easily prevented by a government willing to step in. Sen's conclusions on famines not only launched his career and his persona to new heights, but it clearly influenced the capability approach that we'll be talking about today. And with that said, what the capability approach entails, in short, is this. The best way to ensure the welfare and well-being of people and societies is to maximize their freedom and their ability to try, do, and achieve as much as possible in life. In other words, within the capability approach, happiness equates directly to how much people are capable of doing. Even though this description might seem a bit abstract at the moment, we can still see how Sen's childhood experience may have crafted this. During the famine, Sen's countrymen and women didn't perish because the government or some outside force came in and oppressed their freedoms. They perished because no outside actors did anything at all. As food prices rose to out-of-control levels, the most vulnerable lost their ability to obtain one of their most basic needs. One of their most important capabilities vanished. As you get into the details, the capability approach can become a bit complicated with all of its moving parts. Today we just need to take away two core concepts from Sen's initial work: functionings and capabilities. Functionings are all of the activities and states of existence that people can move through in life. There are basic functionings, things like, as we mentioned before, being well fed, but they also include being sheltered, being warm, or being not sick. Not all functionings are inherently good, however. Being injured, for example, can be a functioning. On top of these basic functionings, there are also some more recreational ones, things like going kite surfing, or playing chess, or going on safari. Again, these types of functionings are not all inherently good. Murder, for example, would technically fall here. All in all, functionings are the things that we can be or can do in our lives. With functionings explained, the concept of capabilities becomes really simple. Capabilities are just simply the ability to realize certain functions. So in the capability approach, the idea goes that the more capabilities that people have in their lives, the better off they'll be and the happier they'll be. Now, certain immoral capabilities, like the capability to murder or commit violence, are set aside and removed from the equation, as we'll see a little bit later in the episode. But as I said, a person who has, say, 1,000 capabilities available to them will, in this theory, be statistically likely to be better off than someone who has, say, 500. What's beautiful about this idea is that the value of many individual capabilities and functionings is taken with a degree of subjectivity. So basic functionings like food or shelter are obviously paramount to everyone. But as we get into the recreational things like playing chess, individual and cultural preferences start to come into play. So even if you have zero interest in playing chess, the capability approach says that if you just have the opportunity in your life to learn and play chess, even if you don't want to, you're likely to be better off. This is because a society that provides you with the tools, the brain development, and the freedom to spend your time playing a game is likely to be a pretty good place to live. And a society that invests in lots of capabilities like these provides its citizens with a blank canvas with which to paint upon their own preferences. Despite all of our similarities as humans, all of us value different activities, take on different interests. We all derive happiness from different things. The capability approach not only builds this in and allows for this, but it's what makes the whole machine work. Now, as we'll also see later, Capability theorists debate about which functionings deserve more emphasis than others. But the big takeaway is this. The ideal, happy life for someone is a life with as many capabilities as possible. The idea is that if you provide people and societies with a platter of these functionings, individuals will find their way to the things that give them the most value. You can think of it much like how water eventually finds its path to its inevitable resting place. Perhaps a better illustration is the old arcades from the 80s and 90s. You can likely bet that arcades where the kids were the happiest and most satisfied were those that had the widest variety of games to choose from. Now, in this light, this entire idea might seem kind of obvious, but as we'll see shortly, our society is really not structured in a way that is aligned with the capability approach in its complete form. And at this point, we're going to move away from the mind of Amartya Sen for the time being. Despite being considered the capability approach's founding figure, Sen's philosophical energy began shifting to other areas of social economics as his career went on. Eventually, a new figure took the helm, our protagonist for today's story, a philosopher named Martha Nussbaum. Martha Nussbaum is an American philosopher who's made her name all over the world of philosophy. Her thinking and writing has covered topics including ancient Greek philosophy, animal rights, sexuality, religion, liberty, justice, and feminism, just to start off the list. Nussbaum is a titan in the field today, with exceptional range in the discipline. But despite all of her work, Nussbaum has spent arguably most of her energy, and earned quite a bit of reputation, developing and championing the capability approach. Nussbaum took Sen's vision of capabilities and began filling in some of the necessary details to further legitimize it. She cites the work of famous philosophers like John Rawls and Aristotle to build a foundation for her work. One of the most important things she's done is advocate for countries to directly measure the amount of capabilities that their people actually possess. She proclaims that if we invest in this process, we can get the most accurate idea of people's overall well-being at the national and even community levels. To stake her claim, she contrasts the capability approach with one of today's most commonly used measuring sticks for societal well-being: gross domestic product. When we talk of how well off a country is today, you'll often hear it in terms of how the economy is doing, or how much money is being generated or flowing through society. One of the primary ways of measuring this is through something called gross domestic product, or GDP. If you live in the U.S., you may recall that much to-do has been made about when and if China will eventually overtake the United States for the number one GDP ranking in the world. GDP is a pretty old measure, originally designed to calculate how much money worth of products and services a nation is pumping out in a given year. The measure was invented during the industrial age, when the production and movement of physical products was the linchpin of the global economy. As time has gone on and what it means to produce has changed, GDP has been modified, but in today's digital economy, this measure has been watered down a bit. Much of the important high-tech work today doesn't produce any sort of physical product at all. It's less straightforward to account for how much dollar value a cybersecurity firm, for example, might generate in comparison to, say, a factory. GDP has largely been accepted as a default measure for prosperity, and as such for how well off a nation's people actually are. But realistically, the correlation isn't that strong. The benefits of living in a society that produces lots of goods don't necessarily trickle down to everyone. As we know, it's possible to be completely and totally destitute in a nation of otherwise high wealth. A good case study of this is the African nation of Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea is a tiny coastal country which today has just over 1 million people living in it. In the mid-90s, they struck oil. The money poured in and their GDP quickly skyrocketed. When adjusted to reflect the per-person average, Equatorial Guinea is currently ranked 55th in the world and the highest in all of mainland Africa. According to the UN, in 2010, their per capita GDP was within the top 30 countries, keeping company with some of the world's most highly developed nations. This sounds like a great fortune for the people of Equatorial Guinea, but in fact, it wasn't. The country has and still ranks among the most impoverished and unequal in the world, contrasting sharply with its material fortunes. And the reason for that was a matter of distribution. Much of the wealth and amenities that came with the country's newfound riches remained with a small oligarchy of people at the top of its totalitarian government. Societal well-being didn't rise much, if at all. Nussbaum argues along these lines to make the point that, while GDP per capita is certainly a fine measure to show a country's potential for creating a happy society, it isn't the end-all be-all by any means. And along these lines, it doesn't seem like other commonly cited economic measures do that job either. The unemployment rate, for example, does give us a broad idea of how the economy is doing, but it doesn't give us an idea of underemployment, struggle, health, and overall well-being of the people. Average income is another figure we often hear about, particularly in judging how well off particular cities are. And again, this works very crudely, but when talking about personal income, we run into something called the Easterlin Paradox. The Easterlin Paradox is a trend discovered by an economist named Richard Easterlin, who over several decades has found evidence suggesting the limits of personal income's effects on happiness. His findings suggest that as the average income of a nation rises, overall well-being will continue to rise with it until a certain point. As incomes continue to go up from there, societal happiness will basically just flatten. Now, Easterlin's work has been both praised and heavily challenged, but my purpose here isn't to take sides one way or the other. The big point to make with this is Easterlin hits on a line of thinking that Nussbaum also uses to support her argument, a line of thinking first put forward by the great Aristotle, that the pursuit of wealth is only a means to an end, that wealth itself shouldn't be the final state that we aim for as people or as societies. Wealth can certainly open our worlds in many ways, but at the end of the day, it's a tool, one of many tools, a tool that may not necessarily be used correctly. For Aristotle, the end wasn't wealth, but was instead happiness or flourishing. So as we've seen, economic measures aren't great as indicators of happiness. So why don't we just measure happiness itself? We just saw that Easterlin was able to do it. Wouldn't it make sense to just go straight to the source? Well, it definitely can be done, mostly using survey data. In fact, this methodology has been catching on a bit in popularity in recent years. Perhaps you're familiar with the UN's World Happiness Report, which in recent years seems to make headlines on an annual basis. News outlets will usually report the top 10 or top 20 happiest countries. It's almost always the Scandinavian countries at the top, and all the American news outlets will make a big stink about how the U.S. didn't crack the top 10 or something like that. Now, calculating happiness is certainly a noble effort, and I think certainly more attractive than using something like GDP as an indicator. But tools like the happiness report have taken massive amounts of criticism for a variety of reasons. Perhaps the biggest is that happiness is a subjective concept that's both personal and cultural, as we've seen. Sure, some of us might be wired up differently in terms of how our physical cheerfulness expresses itself or how we feel it. But the only person who can really determine how happy you are is you. And as we said, we're all so different. So using a survey tool to try to capture all of that is a monster exercise. But perhaps more damning for this measurement is a point that was made by our friends Joshanlu and Veyers from the episode's beginning. Actually feeling or being happy isn't important to everyone. The authors of that study explicitly warned against using tools like the happiness report, as they will almost certainly assume that people are going to place equal value on happiness. As we've also seen from that study, Western cultures tend to place more emphasis on feeling happy. And when you look at the scores from the happiness report, a report that's designed by a Western institution, mind you, and you plot out those scores on a global map, you'll see that all the happiest countries are Western. So this brings us back to capabilities, which both Martha Nussbaum and I are hoping at this point seem much more attractive as a measuring stick for well-being. One of the measures that captures this most closely today is another tool of the UN, the Human Development Index, or HDI. HDI broadly captures not only a country's economic data, but also key social factors like poverty, gender inequality, education, and tons more. HDI doesn't align perfectly line by line with the capability approach, but Nussbaum, Sen, and others certainly advocate it as a measure. Now, one other important thing that Nussbaum has tried to do in her work is figure out which capabilities to prioritize. If we wanted to, we could probably list out millions of capabilities and functionings, some much more critical than others. A minority of capability theorists have argued that we should maximize any and every capability we can think of. But we run into some problems with that. As we mentioned earlier, things like murder and bigotry are technically capabilities. But we've known for millennia that these actions are detrimental to a societal happiness. So there are going to be certain capabilities we want to do away with completely using policy and law. But in addition to that, there are some capabilities that are just pointless. As Nussbaum puts it, many of us are technically capable of trying to stand on our heads and whistle Yankee Doodle Dandy if we really wanted to do that. But will we be any worse off if we couldn't? Per Nussbaum, these types of intrinsically useless capabilities shouldn't be protected, invested in, or really even thought about. In her thinking, Nussbaum put forward 10 categories of core capabilities that are arguably the most recognized and cited set among capability theorists. Her capabilities include some of the basics like health, shelter, political expression, and freedom from violence and discrimination. But she also includes other more self-actualized capabilities like love, play, gratitude, reasoning, being a part of a cohesive group, being literate in math and science, and even just being able to laugh. Nussbaum's list is much longer than what I've listed out here, and if you want to look at it, I recommend checking out her book, which I'll put in the show notes. The key thing that Nussbaum recommends is that this list serve as a sacred text that all democracies use when designing their society. She recommends that countries translate these values into local languages and enshrine them in their constitution. And most importantly, she recommends that they make investments in realizing these capabilities for their people. Being such an ambitious idea, the capability approach is open to a lot of critical response. Some of the main criticism includes that it's too subjective, or it requires an incredible amount of resources or substantial amounts of government intervention, or even that it's downright utopian. None of these arguments at their core discredit the approach, but implementing the capability approach in its most realized form is no doubt riddled with challenges. At its most heightened, a society with all core capabilities maximized would probably look nothing like the global capitalistic world we see today. In many parts of the world, we all ultimately have to worry about providing some value that we can be compensated for in one way or the other. We do this either by working, raising kids, going to school, or just generally being useful to somebody. Now, in cases where people are incapacitated, for example, compensation in some parts of the world will come independent of some form of work. But this is explicitly because their capabilities are limited in a way that doesn't line up with the capitalistic mode of production. A world where the capability approach is maximized wouldn't look like this. People would be able to, in large part, do whatever they want all day. Go hiking, paint, sit down and eat and watch TV all day, run a marathon, go out and be a comedian, etc. Now, of course, there would be limits. It wouldn't be complete anarchy. Certain capabilities, like murder, as we mentioned earlier, would be outlawed completely. There would be morals, rules, laws that help us oversee society. But other than that, your day would be yours to design, and you wouldn't have to worry about food, shelter, or really anything else. Now, Nussbaum and other capability theorists aren't explicitly arguing for this dream world that I've just laid out. What they are advocating for is using the capability approach as a guideline, a benchmark to help us build our world in the best way we can. But this is grand theories. My job here is to think as big as possible. And I don't need to do away with this vaunted land just yet. I think we can save it, and I think we can do that using a thought experiment called the experience machine. A man named Robert Nozick first proposed the idea of the experience machine in the 70s. In his book, Anarchy, the State, and Utopia, Nozick asked his readers to imagine getting hooked up with a bunch of electrodes to a machine which could give you any experience that you want. No matter what you choose, the experience itself would be like jacking into another world. It would feel, look, sound, and smell just as real as today's world. As far as your brain would be concerned, it would be real. And there would be no limits to the type of experiences you could conjure up. No matter what goals or activities align with your subjective sense of happiness, you can create a life full of those in the experience machine. In his thought experiment, Nozick asks his readers to ponder, if given the choice, would they hook into the experience machine indefinitely, or would they say no and continue living their real-world lives? He also asked that people not worry about what could go wrong if you hooked in, such as the machine breaking down, or some questionably motivated scientists running the thing. Just assume that the conditions are perfect. There's no right answer to this question. It's up to you and you alone whether or not you would choose to hop in. But Nozick uses this thought experiment to argue for the value of staying in the real world. And he might be onto something. There is something slightly off about leaving everything I love in this world for a digital, manufactured life. Even if I could bring everyone and everything into my experience, this would by no means be an easy choice. And because of this hesitation, Nozick argues that there's more to life than just the raw satisfaction that the experience machine can provide. As technology has advanced, the concept of the experience machine has become more than just a thought experiment. Humanity's anxieties about this potential scenario have been further expressed in a number of science fiction works. Consider the movie The Matrix. For those that haven't seen it, The Matrix is about a simulated reality run by artificial intelligence that in essence has taken over Earth. At this point, Earth is in a complete state of destruction after a war between the humans and the machines. The machines won the war, and afterward they took humanity and jacked them into the Matrix in order to subdue and use them for energy. While jacked into the Matrix, people's minds are distracted in a world reminiscent of 1999 United States. While in this world, their bodies are entombed in a form of life support. In the movie, a small band of rebels still exists in the real world, and that band of rebels is attempting to free humanity from the grip of the machines. They end up recruiting Keanu Reeves to join the fight, and during their pitch, Lawrence Fishburne asks Keanu to either take a red pill or a blue pill. Taking the blue pill would put Keanu back into the Matrix, causing him to forget the entire recruitment process as well as the truth about reality. He would be able to continue living in digital ignorance. But if he takes the red pill, his mind will forever be freed from the confines of the machines, and he will have an opportunity to fight them and bring humanity back to the real world. This very binary decision is incredibly reminiscent of the choice that Nozick offers us. The Matrix was filmed 20 years ago when this type of technology, while not as abstract as in Nozick's time, still seemed far off and distant. But in 2019, the capability and perhaps inevitability to simulate life on an ultra-realistic scale seems more and more imminent. In works like The Matrix, these experience machines are presented with a dark, dystopian overtone. And this is warranted to some degree. This type of technology in the wrong hands would be troublesome for many. But today's society, in many ways, seems to be at a critical intersection. As our lives and who we are continue to digitize, and as virtual reality and Elon Musk's Neuralink come closer on the horizon, we're overdue to do some serious thinking about Nozick's question. And in light of today's central topic, an experience machine seems it could be the less resource-intensive way to build out a world inspired by the deepest vision of Nussbaum and Sen. And while maybe at this moment you or I wouldn't choose to hop in an experience machine, we can't rule out that others might. Consider somebody with a terminal illness, or someone in unfathomable amounts of pain, or someone who is permanently immobilized due to a disability. If you haven't experienced any of those ailments directly, could you really truly know how you would answer if you had them? If the experience machine can offer some relief or reprieve to anybody, who are we to say that they wouldn't want to or shouldn't go in? On top of what I've just argued, there's another important reason to consider the idea: automation and artificial intelligence. I think many of us want to imagine that a full-fledged general AI is still pretty far off, for obvious reasons. But we can't deny that there are some very smart, very rich people who are investing tons of energy and money into making such a thing real. And if AI is born, our lives will undoubtedly change. And I'm not necessarily talking in the Skynet sense, where all of humanity is wiped out, although certainly that could happen. But we have to consider the true benefits that ultra-intelligent AI could bring us if it's developed in the right way. Labor may never be necessary again, freeing humanity from the need to work and produce in order to support our basic functionings. If we no longer need to use our bodies to produce, humanity will truly be free to think, create, explore, and be capable of much more. And certainly we can do that in the very real world of Earth, and perhaps beyond. But we also need to consider that just as AI is on the horizon, so could be a real live experience machine. And if developed and made accessible in the right way, it could produce a life that a capability theorist may have thought to only dream of. Thank you guys so much for listening to the 4th episode. I hope you enjoyed this one. Again, it was a little different. This is a dive into some practical ethics, but in my opinion, just as broad and as important to our thinking as everything else we've covered. Next month is going to be Impossible Worlds on episode 5. This is a super mind-bending concept that I am really excited to bring to you all, and we're going to connect it with a few other wild philosophical ideas, so it should be a good one. Look for that towards the end of August. As always, contact me, tweet at me, get in touch if you have anything you want to talk about. I look forward to hearing from all of you. So thank you again for continuing to listen, and we will see you next month.